Good day to all of you. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me today to talk on the topic Code Neuro Managing Catastrophic Emergency in the First Hour. There is nothing I would like to disclose, and that I have no conflict of interest in this particular forum. The objective for my discussion will center on the following. First, I would like to explain why the first hour in neurocatastrophe is critical. Second, I would like to identify the most critical and time-sensitive neurological emergencies grouped into key categories. For the sake of time, which was given an hour by the organizing, I would just like to highlight on the neurovascular emergency composing of acute ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, and aneurysm, including cerebral venous thrombosis. And lastly, I will be providing you with key takeaways for nurses. Now, let me begin by saying that a catastrophic neurological emergency are life-threatening conditions affecting the brain, your spinal cord, or the peripheral nerves. It can cause irreversible damage or even death in just a few minutes. What we all need to understand is that this emergency requires a rapid, coordinated medical intervention, and that we must be able to recognize red flag symptoms like sudden loss of consciousness, paralysis, or severe headache in critical care. Now, this is because we all understand that the brain has just less than 4 to 6 minutes for ischemic tolerance. That's the reason why we call this time is neurons. I would like to present to you the most critical and time-sensitive neurological emergencies, which we will be grouping into key categories. The first category is neurovascular emergency, which includes acute ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic strokes and aneurysm, and the cerebral venous thrombosis. The second category entails neuromuscular emergencies like myasthenia crisis, the Guillain-Barré syndrome. Third category entails intracranial pressure crisis, which includes brain edema or swelling and acute hydrocephalus. Fourth category refers to spinal emergency, which includes acute spinal cord compression. And lastly, we have seizures and infections, which will include our status epilepticus and meningitis and encephalitis. So moving on, as I have mentioned earlier in my objective, we will just be focusing for this particular session neurovascular emergencies like acute ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke and aneurysm, and the cerebral venous thrombosis. So I will be presenting to you the perspective in acute ischemic stroke. So let me just address the epidemiological component of stroke. Worldwide, it is known to be the third leading cause of death, and this remains to be one of the major causes of disability worldwide. The incidence, however, is reflected as increasing due to age population. However, young adult age group are also affected by stroke in the middle and low income countries. In the high income countries, prevention, acute treatment, and rehabilitation has led to extensive and continuous development, and there is now a significant reduction in the burden of stroke over the last 3 decades in this particular subset of economic countries. Now, let me share to you the Philippines. The Philippines epidemiological data shows that stroke is the second leading cause of death and is the main cause of morbidity. Stroke deaths in our country have reached about 11% of the total death, and this is a statistics given by the World Health Organization in 2020. We also have national policies and legislation in trying to prevent and address the risks which are related to the said disease. There are administrative orders, policy frameworks, and management for acute stroke. Now, when we talk about stroke and critical care, we do understand that this is a growing number of stroke patients that requires ICU admission for either neurological monitoring or the management of stroke complication, and that it has a 10 to 30% becoming a critically ill candidate. Now, stroke patients without treatment options are increasingly being admitted to ICU to facilitate organ donations. Now, among patients with stroke, there is a significant difference that exists between those admitted to ICUs and those admitted to neurological wards or just the stroke units. The ICU group is characterized by greater neurological severity as it is measured using the validated tools like your NIH stroke scale, moderate to severe conscious impairment, and the need for mechanical ventilation in most cases. It's still well known that there is a high hospital mortality and morbidity. However, let us be clear that the epidemiology of stroke requires ICU admission is still unclear. So let's look at the numbers according to the study of Carval et al. Among 323 patients, you would see here the cascade of the status of the patient. 98% of these 323 patients are intubated on the first ICU day. 66.3% are given decisions to limit the life support treatment within 1 to 8 days. And about 38.3% of stroke-related complication, the highest is pertaining to intracranial hypertension and hydrocephalus. 18.9% are very sick, that they can no longer benefit from life-sustaining therapies but are potential organ donors. That's why they're kept in ICU. 25.1% happens to be an acute case of stroke wherein therapy was given. 75.3% are patients with intracerebral hemorrhage, and only 24.7% with ischemic stroke. 2.2% develop acute respiratory distress syndrome, and 1.5% would succumb to septic shock. Now, what does this all signify? In the 323 patients, you would see that there is a high mortality rate of ICU cases. It's about 81%. It's very high. So, and that 45.2% are given limitations for treatment. They can no longer be cured, so they're sent to palliative care. There are factors associated with the 6 month modified ranking scale score, and that we all know that the ranking scale is a widely used tool that assesses the degrees of disability or dependence in the daily activities of individuals who have experienced stroke or other neurological disabilities. In relation to the study of Carval et al., they have assessed variables at ICU admission, which is associated with an MRS score of 0 to 2 at 6 months. This would mean that there is uh, a lesser chance of greater mortality or even morbidity with this particular score. What they have found out is that those patients with higher GCS score are likely to be scored at 0 to 2 at 6 months, including patients with persistent papillary light reflex and those with higher body temperature, and patients who have received acute ACE stroke therapy at the onset of their stroke. Now, the higher risk of disability or death are associated with older age, hemorrhagic versus ischemic stroke, or even those patients on mechanical ventilation, or those patients with greater acute illness. Now, there are two independent predictors with having an MRS between 0 and 2 at 6 months. The older age was negatively associated with a greater chance of survival, while those with higher GCS score are positively associated with a 0 to 2 MRS score at 6 months. Now, in conclusion, according to the study of Carval et al., most patients admitted in ICU for stroke had severely impaired consciousness, they will be requiring mechanical ventilation, and were ineligible for acute phase stroke therapy. Now, three-fifths of the patients died, and only one-fifth had a good 6 month neurological outcome. The older age and worse consciousness impairment at ICU admission were independently associated with very poor prognosis or outcomes. However, they said that further studies are needed to identify criteria for choosing the appropriate level of ICU care in patients with acute stroke. So let me just bring to you briefly the new guidelines for the early management of patients with acute ischemic stroke. And this is the 2026 American Heart Association and American Stroke Association guidelines. And I have placed there the site where you can download these particular guidelines. Now, of course, this guideline has already replaced the 2018 guidelines for the early management of patients with acute ischemic stroke, and that the 2019 update reflected recent advances in the evidence. So, this updated guideline is intended to provide a comprehensive, up to date evidence based set and the recommendations advising management and treatment for acute stroke in the early in hospital management of complications and the initiation of early secondary prevention measures. So, the intended audience would include pre hospital care professionals, the physicians and allied health professionals, and hospital administrators to look into these guidelines so they will be updated in their knowledge, skills, and behavior pertaining to the early management of acute ischemic stroke. So now I would like to present to you the chronological timeline commonly following the initial symptom of stroke, which is often divided into five separate phases. These phases in the post-stroke timeline are based on what is happening in the brain from a structural point of view as the patient repairs and heals itself from stroke. The subacute phase is a prime time for rehabilitation. However, people are also vulnerable due to suppressed immune functions and chronic inflammation. So, regular medical tests and preventive treatments can help limit your post stroke complications. Under a multidisciplinary therapy program, it is possible to regain motor skills, communications, and everyday life function. So, look at the timeline. You would see here that stroke can occur in a pre-hospital phase. The first 24 hours is considered as the critical phase. This is hyperacute that goes into acute phase within 1 to 7 days. Now, within 1 week to 3 months, this is the period of subacute phase. We have the early subacute phase and the late phase. Now, 1 week to 3 months and 3 months to 6 months are what we consider the post-acute phase. After 6 months and so forth, stroke now becomes a chronic illness. So, looking at this, physiologically, hyperacute phase occurs in the first 24 hours, wherein the first symptom of stroke occurs up to 6 hours when the stroke appears. What happens is the brain's blood supply in certain regions is disrupted, and a core of neuronal tissue would die. There is swelling within the brain as well as the loss of oxygen and nutrients. Because stroke can cause damage to the brain, and the brain is a vital organ to sustain bodily functions, having a stroke is a medical emergency. So the individual needs to get to a hospital as fast as possible so the stroke team can focus on saving their life, saving the brain, and controlling other organ systems into the body from failing. Now, cell death and swelling is happening because of the stroke, and every second counts to save the brain. Now, we have to take action, and our action should be reacting quickly. We have to follow the guidelines using the acronym Be Fast to get to the hospital ASAP if you know something is wrong. Now, the Be Fast is a mnemonic, which is a simple way to remember wherein you can diagnose or probably take into consideration that the person is having a stroke. BPAS refers to balance, eyes, face, arms, speech, and time. It is an updated version of FAST acronym that is used to help memorize the signs of stroke. Okay, so as I have mentioned earlier, there is an area around the dead tissue which is called as a penumbra. The penumbra makes up billions of brain cells that envelopes the dead tissue, and these cells may be failing and are temporarily non-functional. However, do take note that the penumbra is still viable and may return from a state of shock. So what is really important is our timely assessment and our rapid management, bringing the patient to the emergency department. So let me bring to your attention the 2026 guideline on stroke scale. It has been a recommendation that the stroke scare, if you have a suspected acute ischemic stroke, the use of stroke severity rating ratio is preferred to be the NIH stroke scale. This has been recommended for measuring clinical deficit at baseline and after reperfusion therapies. So the example of an interpretation of NIH score will include the following. Based on the numeric 0 to 4 is minor stroke with clinical implication related to recovery may be well or often eligible for TPA. A score ranging from 5 to 15 is considered a moderate stroke. You can consider TPA or you can consider EVT if the large vessel occlusion. For a range of 16 to 20, this is considered moderate to severe stroke, and there is a very high risk of complication. While a score of greater than 20 is a severe stroke with very poor prognosis and however, they may still benefit from EBT if they met the criteria. So moving onward, let's focus on the highly acute phase, which is considered a medical emergency. During the first hours of critical illness, this particular management will help shape the patient's long-term recovery and prognosis. First, we'd like to look into the triaging phase. We'd like to identify stroke signs and symptoms. We'd like to recognize the onset of the stroke symptom from the last time the patient was seen well or normal. Then we activate stroke code and initiate rapid transfer to a designated bed. So we nurses must be able to recognize the medical history and lifestyle risk factors for the onset of stroke. We have to gather medical or surgical history of the patient, what the medications and anticoagulant treatment the patient is receiving, and even if the patient has stroke risk factors. With this particular information, we will be able to deliver a rapid management and treatment and rapidly transfer the patient to the dedicated bed or to the proper area for possible management and treatment. Now, triage is a very important nursing element, particularly for timely assessment, triage, and rapid management of acute stroke in the emergency department. We have to use evidence-based stroke screening tools at triage, such as the Los Angeles Pre-Hospital Stroke Screen and the Cincinnati Pre-Hospital Stroke Scale for the recognition of stroke in the emergency room scare. So, there are assignment of high severity triage category, which should be seen and done within less than 10 minutes upon arrival to the emergency room. And we must be able to implement a standardized triage system, such as the Emergency Severity Index. And as you can see in the right side of this PowerPoint, there are levels of our ESI that determines the category and severity of the patient. Now, there should be system to urgently notify the hospital stroke team and a pre-notification and initiation of the code stroke is very important after the patient is seen in triage. The reason for this is we would like to achieve rapid brain imaging and assessment for suitability for our RTPA. Now, thrombolytic administration is indicated with the door-to-needle time guidelines, which is recommended to be equal or less than 60 minutes. Now, there are key nursing elements in triage that we must be able to observe. And this pertains to the code stroke alerts, which include pre-notification, rapid assessment of airway, breathing, circulation, and disability, rapid patient registration, priority use of CT scanner, immediate in IV access, immediate transfer to the CT unit, rapid imaging interpretation, rapid control of arterial blood pressure, and our RTPA bolus and infusion, which should be initiated when recommended and met the criteria. So assessment of initial stroke severity using your NIH stroke scale on arrival to ED and before after treatment is necessary because this helps in the imaging of the brain with either non-contrast and CT or MRI within 25 minutes of arrival to the ED. Our RTPA administration should start before the use of additional imaging sequences like your CT angiography. So according to the 2026 AHA stroke guidelines on thrombolysis, it says that acute ischemic stroke endorses tenecteplase as a preferred or equivalent alternative to alteplase RTPA within 4.5 hours of symptom onset. So, for wake-up strokes or unknown onset, advanced imaging like CT or MRI can be used to identify patients who may benefit from thrombolysis beyond the 4.5 hours up to 24 hours. Now, the key updates includes expanded use of advanced imaging to select patients for thrombolysis up to 24 hours and a strong emphasis on rapid treatment for those patients with disabling stroke. Now, thrombolysis is recommended for this disabling mild stroke and is also can be considered from non-disabling or mild deficit where dual action therapy is preferred. Let's get back to the key elements for rapid transfer of patients with acute stroke. We all know that an organized stroke unit care significantly reduces death and disability and will improve processes of care as grouping patients together by clinical specialty, and it is associated with improved outcomes. That's the reason why it is recommended that patients should be cared for in a dedicated stroke unit. Rapid transfer must be made from the ED to the stroke unit, which is very important. A pre-notification of stroke team can facilitate rapid transfer to the stroke unit on admission, and using stroke protocols may facilitate the rapid transfer to the stroke unit on admission. Lastly, there should be a formal appointment of a stroke coordinator, which will streamline stroke system processes and strengthen quality improvement of stroke services. Now, in the first 24 hours of acute stroke, we must be able to look into the followings. The 6 hours of stroke onset is considered the hyperacute stroke patient category. And here, what we have to do is to determine the eligibility for treatment using IV recombinant tissue plasminogen activator within given when treated within 3 hours. Now, interventional treatment options may also be used within 6 hours of stroke onset. What is very important is to be able to draw the first 30 minutes into a specialist assessment. We must be able to do neurological determination of the type and the level of stroke, do brain scanning to determine if it is ischemic or hemorrhagic, and that to determine if the patient is eligible for thrombolysis or surgery. Now, this first 30 minutes will also ensure that appropriate medical treatment is given and that there should be a fast transfer to the hyperacute stroke bed care for specialized monitoring. Now, all of these are usually completed in the first hour upon arrival in the emergency department or in the acute stroke unit. So, in the first 3 days after a stroke, your hyperacute care is very important because on these first 3 days, there is imminent danger and increased mortality or morbidity to the patient who is having stroke. Now, if we look at an integrated care pathway for a 72-hour stroke care bundle, you would see here that it is important to rapidly initiate a stroke screen using EuroShare or do the ABCDD assessment, particularly when your transient ischemic attack is suspected. Have the patient brought to brain CT scan within less than 24 hours. Put the patient on NPO till bedside swallow screen test is done, and this should be within less than 24 hours. Provide aspirin within 48 hours if hemorrhagic stroke has been excluded in your assessment, and do physiological monitoring and management of urostatus, blood sugar, blood pressure, hydration status for the first 72 hours. So recap, what do we do during the acute care? First and foremost, we prepare for the CT and CTA or angio scan as soon as possible. We assess the airway, breathing, and circulation. We connect the patient to the cardiac monitor and, of course, monitor vital signs. We assess stroke severity by applying the National Institute of Health Stroke Scale or NIHSS and evaluate inclusion and exclusion criteria for eligibility for RTPA administration. We monitor blood glucose and provide treatment of less than 60 millimeter per diluent according to the physician's order. And we monitor and manage blood pressure appropriately and in accordance with the physician's order, which is usually less than 140 over 90 millimeter mercury. Now, remember that the targeted blood pressure in most guideline is that we reduce the level is to reduce the level below 140 to 90 millimeter mercury if possible, and if tolerated to about 130 over 80 millimeter mercury or even lower. Lastly, we have to recognize this particular targeted blood pressure, particularly specific for patient with stroke. So, continuing what we have to do during acute care, we have to identify and differentiate stroke signs, symptoms, and stroke mimics. We obtain 12-lead ECG and identify abnormal cardiac rhythm. And because the atrial fibrillation is the arrhythmia that is most commonly associated with stroke, then we have to maintain oxygen saturation to less than 94%, establish intravenous access, 218 with a, and if possible, use a 218 gauge cannula. We administer appropriate fluids according to the stroke type and following the physician's order, and assess the need for nasogastric or orogastric tube insertion and catheterization insertion before TPA is administered. Then we have to perform initial bedside swallow screening and assess for transient ischemic attack risk and recurrence using the proper tool, your ABCDD. Moving on, we know that we have to identify the different signs and symptoms of stroke mimics. This is characterized according to age, sex, level of consciousness, onset, symptoms of severity, risk factors, vascular territory, blood pressure at presentation, even signs and symptoms, and involuntary movements, imaging, and EEG. This would differentiate your stroke from the mimics. Then we obtain the 12-lead ECG and identify abnormal cardiac rhythm. And as you can see, the most common arrhythmia will be your atrial fibrillation. Maintain your oxygen saturation at greater than 94%. Establish your access, IV access, and administer appropriate fluids according to the stroke type. And that we must remember that for most patients with acute stroke and volume depletion, isotonic saline without dextrose is the agent of choice for intravascular fluid repletion and the maintenance of your fluid therapy. Therefore, it is best to avoid free water like that of a 0.5% isotonic saline. Also, hypotonic fluids can exacerbate your cerebral edema, particularly when acute stroke is happening. Assess for your nasogastric or orogastric tube insertion and catheterization insertion before your TPA administration. Perform initial bedside swallow screening and assess for transient ischemic attack, or what we call the risk and recurrence using the proper tool. The ABCD tool is a score that can assess for risk, and this is designed to improve the prediction of a short-term stroke risk after a TIA. The score is optimized to predict the risk of stroke within 2 days after your TIA, but can also predict stroke risk within 90 days. So, other risk factors that you have to consider would be the following. This is your ABCDD score that focuses on your age, blood pressure, clinical features of TIA that you can choose one and assign points of either two or one, the duration of your TIA, which you can also assign points of two and one, and diabetes. So age, blood pressure, clinical features of TIA, duration, and diabetes. So whatever the score, it would now be predictive of the risk of an impending or a coming back attack. Then we have to monitor vital signs for post-TPA, transferring to hyperacute stroke unit or ICU if necessary, and cardiac monitoring after your post-TCPA per your hospital protocol. And that you have to again continue performing neurological assessment post your TPA administration. So your vital signs check and neurological assessment is strictly protocolized as per consensus guideline on post-IBT care, mandating the check every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours, every 30 minutes for the next 6 hours, and every 6 hours thereafter as part of the current standard of care. Moving on, we would like to say we have to apply precautions after your TPA and monitoring for any thrombolytic complications. Now, the complication related to IV RTPA would include symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage, major systemic hemorrhage, and angioedema in approximately 6%, 2%, and 5% of patients, respectively. So, proper positioning is also appropriate after your TPA and obtaining your NIHSS score of every 24 hours post RTPA is also recommended. So, in positioning, the patient should be kept on bed rest for the first 24 hours after infusion and advanced activity as tolerated. Early mobilization is associated with better outcomes. Next, the head position in the hospital is recommended to reduce intracranial pressure and risk of aspiration pneumonia, and this is referred to by the Japanese guidelines. Keeping the head in neutral alignment with the body and elevating the head of the bed to 30 degrees per patient is also recommended in the acute case of stroke. The head of bed should be individualized with respect to the risk of elevated intracranial pressure, the aspiration or dysphagia, and the presence of comorbid cardiopulmonary disease like cardiopulmonary decompensation or oxygen desaturation. So, let's talk about pre and post op thrombectomy management. What is important is that we have an NIHS score before the procedure. We must also conduct pre-procedural assessment that includes the vital signs, medical histories, allergies, medication, and laboratory results. A proper discussion of sedation with the physician and documentation of the blood pressure is essential. Likewise, you have to monitor the vital signs and conduct neurological assessment at least, at least every 30 to 60 minutes before the procedure. Then, obtaining the post-procedural NIHS score is really very important. Check the vital signs and conduct your assessment. Check your procedure site and conduct post-procedural circulation assessment also. Then monitor for post-procedural complications. The complications that can be associated with thrombectomy can be broadly considered as being inherent to the tissue surrounding the stroke itself, like hyperglycemia, temperature deregulation, arrhythmias, hemodynamic instability, even aspiration, respiratory failure, and infection. These complications may arise due to issues that are commonly encountered in all critically ill patients, such as stress ulcer, pressure ulcer, and peripheral venous thrombosis. Secondarily related to the procedure, like hemorrhagic conversion and malignant edema, or a direct complication, such as volume overload, arteriotomy site complication, the vessel's perforation, vasospasm, device retention, and vessel reocclusion. So remember that the nurse plays a vital role in assisting the neurological team with obtaining the detailed neurological assessment, frequently monitoring the vital and neurological status, and being cognizant of the complication and urgent intervention if needed. So, this is time to know if you are listening. So, wake up, guys, because I will be presenting to you a case and I would like you to answer the following question. And here is the case. A 68-year-old female with history of hypertension and diabetes mellitus presented to the emergency department after acute onset of speech difficulty and right-sided weakness. Her symptoms began 3 hours ago. On physical examination, the patient was found to have severe expressive epiplegia, right hemiplegia, and right hemosensory loss. So the question number one. The single most important component of this history is choose your answer. Is it A, the exact time of onset of symptom? Is it B, family history of stroke? Is it C, which refers to answers A and B? Or D, none of the above? I will give you time to answer the question in the chat box. Now, if your answer is A, you are correct. The single most important component of history is the exact time of the onset of the symptom. This is the time of the, this is defined as the time when the patient was last known to be symptom free, and this is commonly referred to as the last known well time. Now let's continue about the case. The patient has an initial NIHSS of 11. Non-contrast CT of the head did not show any evidence of intracerebral hemorrhage. The CT angiography revealed left M1 occlusion, and the patient underwent mechanical thrombectomy with marked improvement in symptoms. A repeat NIHSS was a score of 3, and the patient was transferred to the neurological critical care unit for further monitoring. Now, the question is, the NIH stroke scale of 11 will mean, is it A, 80% of stroke survivor will be discharged to home? Or B, is it typically required acute inpatient rehabilitation? Or C, this is frequently requiring long-term skilled care? Or D, outcome will depend on other consideration? Please write your answers in the chat box. Now, if your answer is B, an NIH stroke scale score of 11 indicates a moderately severe stroke severity. This suggests that the patient may require acute inpatient rehabilitation. So let's go to case number 2. A 20-year-old man with no past medical history presented to a primary stroke center with sudden left-sided weakness and imbalance followed by decreased level of consciousness. Head CT showed no hemorrhage, no acute ischemic changes, and hyperdense basilar artery. The CT angiography showed a mild basilar occlusion. So the question is, which of the following consideration will make the patient not eligible to receive thrombolytic therapy? 1. Onset of symptoms less than 3 hours before beginning treatment. 2. No head trauma or prior stroke in the past 3 months. 3. No heart attack like MI in the past 3 months. And 4. No GI or genitourinary hemorrhage in the past 21 days. The options for answer are A, 1 and 2, B, 2 and 3, C, all of the above, and D, none of the above. I'll give you another few seconds to answer the question in the chat box. Now, the answer is D, none of the above, because all these particular choices will make the patient eligible to receive thrombolytic therapy. Now let's look at case 3. The 62-year-old woman with a history of hypertension and hyperlipidemia presented to a primary stroke center with sudden onset of weakness of the right side. On examination, she had a global aphasia, left gaze preference, field cut, right facial droop, dysarthria, and right hemiplegia, with an NIHSS scale of 22. The head CT showed only equivocal hypodensity in the left middle cerebral artery territory, and CT angiography showed a left middle cerebral artery occlusion. She was given Altiplase intravenous TPA at 2 hours from symptoms onset and transferred to a comprehensive stroke center where digital subtraction angiography confirmed she had left middle cerebral artery occlusion. Question number 4. Considering the result of DSA, what do you think would be the next best step in the management of this particular patient? Letter A, give another dose of Altiplase intravenous RTPA. Letter B, maintain the patient on anticoagulant therapy. Letter C, prepare patient for mechanical thrombectomy. Or D, prepare for possible rehabilitation. Please write your answer in the chat box and I'll give you a few seconds to do it. Now, if the answer is C, you are correct. You have to prepare patient for mechanical thrombectomy because he already received an Altiplase intravenous TPA and was transferred to a comprehensive stroke center where angiography confirmed mid-bacillary occlusion. He underwent mechanical thrombectomy with recanalization at the basilar artery, following the digital subtraction angiography confirming a left middle cerebral artery occlusion. The management should focus on restoring the blood flow and preventing further damage. So, potentially involving thrombolytics like TPA or mechanical thrombectomy, along with an ongoing preventive measures. Question number 5. What will be your priority action in preparing the patient for thrombectomy? Is it letter A, rapid time-sensitive assessment and stabilization to minimize door-to-device time? B, securing an informed consent from patients? D, coordinating with endovascular laboratory? Or E, none of the above? Please answer in the chat box and I'll give you a few seconds to do that. If your answer is letter A, you are correct. You have to provide rapid, time-sensitive assessment and stabilization to minimize the door-to-device time. The mechanical thrombectomy has become standard of care for emergent large vessel occlusion of stroke. Its estimates of incidence for thrombectomy eligibility will vary significantly, and an NIHSS score of 10 or greater is highly predictive of a large vessel occlusion. So she underwent mechanical thrombectomy with recanalization of the middle cerebral artery. The next day, she had only a very mild expressive aphasia and right facial droop with NIHSS score of 2. 3 months later, she had no neurological deficit and her NIHSS score is 0. So, these are all the answers to the question that I have asked. Thank you for your cooperation in this interactive question and answer. Now, let us proceed. Let us conclude the first part about our stroke, because not all stroke in their acute case should be admitted in the ICU. While severe stroke with complications warrant intensive care, many patients with mild to moderate strokes can be managed effectively in a general stroke unit or the ward. So, many patients admitted to ICU for stroke had severely impaired consciousness requiring them ventilation, and they are ineligible for acute phase stroke therapy. Now, stroke is a medical emergency, and care provided in the first hour is critical in shaping patients' long term recovery and prognosis. Therefore, we all know that organized stroke unit care and the interplay of multidiscipline management can significantly reduce death and disability and improve the processes of care, which is associated with improved patient outcomes. So let's go now to the second neurovascular emergency, hemorrhagic strokes and aneurysm. By definition and pathophysiology, this is bleeding into the brain parenchyma or ventricular system that accounts for approximately 13% of all strokes, but about 40% of stroke deaths. So it's very high. There are several types of hemorrhagic stroke and cerebral aneurysm. For your stroke hemorrhagic, we have intracerebral and subarachnoidal type. This is determined by location and common cause. And specifically, this type presents key features, like for your intracerebral hemorrhage, you have focal deficit plus decreased level of consciousness and headache. For your subarachnoidal, you see here the feature will be the worst headache of life. Now, pertaining to your cerebral aneurysm, this is defined as the outpoaching of arterial wall, usually in the circle of Willis bifurcation, and this causes rupture that leads to your subarachnoidal hemorrhage. Now let's talk more about the signs of aneurysm rupture that can lead to subarachnoidal hemorrhage. There is a classic triad wherein it includes severe sudden headache with knuckle rigidity and a decreasing level of consciousness. Other red flags associated with ruptured aneurysm will be a thunderclap headache with peaks in less than 60 seconds. Nausea and vomiting, including hypotophobia, can accompany this particular rupture. A sentinel bleeding, which is milder headache for days to weeks before the rupture, can be experienced by the person, including seizures or cranial nerve 3 palsy with a dilated pupil if there is posterior communicating artery aneurysm. Other signs of red flags will be meningismus, Ergner or Buczynski signs. Now, if you have an unruptured aneurysm, this can often be asymptomatic. You will not feel anything. However, this may cause your central nervous system deficit, headache, or profound incidentally, or found incidentally. Sorry for that. So the initial assessment for the first 60 minutes would include using your ABCDE plus neuro assessment, your airway, breathing, with the risk of aspiration with low GCS, your blood pressure. You have to keep your blood pressure from systolic pressure of 140 to 160 millimeter mercury per American Heart Association and American Stroke Association standard in 2022, and avoid your systolic blood pressure greater than 180 for subarachnoidal pre-secure. Your examination should be done every 15 minutes. Your examination includes your Glasgow Coma Scale, pupils, NIHSS, Hunt and Hess for your subarachnoidal hemorrhage. You have to immediately do non-contrast CT head, which is the golden standard, and CT angio for aneurysm. Laboratories will include your CBC, your PT proton beam time, your what do you call this? Your international normalized ratio, or your partial thromboplatin time, which is PTT, including your basal metabolic panel, including a troponin test or toxicity screening and pregnancy test. Always maintain seizure precaution by putting the head of the bed 30 degrees with your side rails padded and up. So the Hunt and Hess grading for subarachnoidal hemorrhage is a bedside clinical test that nurses and doctors uses to assess severity of subarachnoidal hemorrhage. And of course, they do it right when the patient arrives because this will predict mortality and help guide how aggressive management should be made. The grading system consists of 1 to 5 based on clinical presentation, which is equivalent to mortality risk. And there are nursing implication that goes with the grading system of Hunt and Hess. Hunt and Hess, when compared to some other subarachnoidal hemorrhage scales, is the only exam that you can do at the bedside. All the rest, like the Fisher scale and the World Federation of Neurological Society grading scale, are need we have to have a CT appearance with amount and location of blood that can predict vasospasm risk, while your World Federation Neurological Society's grading scale will use the Glasgow Coma Scale plus a focal deficit, which is used in research and surgery. Now, moving on, when we have acute cases, we have to manage this medically. There are two types of management, one for the intracerebral hemorrhage bundle, and another is for the subarachnoidal hemorrhage bundle. The bundle of ICH includes BP control with the use of IV nicardipine, labetalol, or clibidipine with a target systolic blood pressure of 140 millimeter mercury. There should also be reverse coagulopathy with vitamin A plus 4-factor PCC for warfarin, idursulfimab for dabigatran, and andesactin alpha for XA inhibitors. We also have to provide for increased intracranial pressure by using your mannitol 20% or 3% hypertonic saline if there are herniation signs. And of course, surgery can also be employed as a management with the EVD, hematoma evacuation, if there is a cerebellar of greater than 3 centimeter or deteriorating symptoms. For your subarachnoidal hemorrhage bundle, we have to secure the aneurysm with coiling or surgical clipping as soon as possible, that is less than 24 hours. Prevention of rebleed with a systolic blood pressure of less than 160 until secured, putting the patient in bed rest, and providing for stool softeners. Vasospasm prophylaxis will include your nimodipine 60 mg per aurum every 4 hours for 21 days to improve patient outcome, and maintaining the patient to pneumobulimia to avoid hypovolemia, and there should be no triple H therapy routinely given to the patient. So moving on, this triple H will include your hypovolemia, hemodilution, and sorry, went to us. Okay, let me just proceed. So there are nursing priorities during complications. This will include rebleeding, vasospasm, hydrocephalus, seizures, and hyponatremia. So this particular complication can happen with a timing, peaking, rebleeding, peaking at 0 to 24 hours after your subarachnoidal hemorrhage, vasospasm about 3 to 14 days post subhemorrhage, hydrocephalus hours to days, seizures 24 to 48 hours, and your hyponatremia 3 to 10 days. We must be familiar with how to do our nursing assessment and, of course, intervention based on the complication and the proximity of anticipation of the time this particular complication may occur. So our EVD and our ICP monitoring pearls include maintaining the level of transducer to the tragus of ear to the foramen of Monroe. As you can see here, this should be your tragus of ear and the foramen of Monroe. Okay, so the drainage is also something that we should be mindful. Only when ordered, you can document the color. You only drain it only when ordered by documenting the color, the clarity, and the amount every 1 hour. Make sure to clump your drain during transport, during repositioning, during ICP reading, and you have to slowly unclamp it. For infection control, you have to use sterile, strict aseptic technique, monitor for fever, and even presentation of cloudy central your CSF fluid. For ICP monitoring, keep your ICP within normal, which is 5 to 15 millimeter mercury, and your CPP should be equivalent to your MAP minus your ICP. The goal for your CPP is about 60 or greater than 60 millimeter mercury. So the patient and family education before discharge will include informing them about warning signs, sudden severe headache, neck stiffness, vision changes, weakness, and that they should be able to immediately call for a 911 to expedite bringing the patient to the hospital. Orient them also regarding BP control with home monitoring, medical adherence with a goal of blood pressure in less than 130/80. Also advise for lifestyle changes like smoking cessation, limiting alcohol, avoiding straining and heavy lifting for about 4 to 6 weeks after the coiling. For medication, they have to continue minodipine full 21 days even if the patient is already asymptomatic. For screening, first-degree relatives of ruptured aneurysm should be discussed because they are prone to development of aneurysm. That's why they should engage themselves to an MRA or a CT angiography screening. So let's look at the case. 66 female patient with hypertension was found laying down. Her Glasgow Coma Scale is 8. The blood pressure is hypertensive at 210/110, and the left pupil is 5 millimeters sluggish. What would be your first impression or nursing? I'm sorry. What would be your first nursing action? The second question is, what blood pressure target do you anticipate? And number two question is, what are you monitoring or what should you be monitoring for the next 72 hours? Please write your answer in the chat box and I'll give you a few seconds to answer it. Okay. If your answer for number one is securing airway and intubation, you are correct. For number two, the targeted systolic blood pressure is 140 to 160. And if this is your answer, you are correct. For the third question, the answer is monitor for rebleeding, herniation, and vasospasm. So for those who got the answer, very good. So the key takeaway for our hemorrhagic aneurysm, either subarachnoidal or intracerebral hemorrhage, would include the following. Remember, time is brain, hemorrhagic stroke is neuroemergency, and that you have to pursue a door to CT scan in less than 20 minutes. We must prevent secondary injury by BP control, preventing rebleeding, and treating vasospasm. We must frequently and appropriately do our neurological examination because it saves lives. Subtle changes like herniation, vasospasm, and hydrocephalus are some of the complications that can arise due to hemorrhages. Nimodipine should be given for all subarachnoidal hemorrhage, and this is the only drug proven to improve the outcome. Then educate the people about the worst headache of life. When they experience this, they need to dial 911 and not just treat it with ibuprofen. Now let's go to our last neurovascular emergency, cerebral venous thrombosis. So pathophysiologically, CVT is not an arterial stroke. It is thrombosis of the dural venous sinuses and or the cerebral vein, which is blocked of the venous drainage. This results in increased venous pressure leading to cerebral edema, venous infarction, increase intracranial pressure, and hemorrhage. The most common site wherein your CVT occurs will be your superior sagittal sinus, wherein 62% of this occurs in this particular location. Your transverse sinus, about 41 to 44%, and the straight sinus cortical veins. The key difference from an arterial stroke and CVT are the following. Arterial stroke would have loss of venous inflow, and there is infarction in the artery territory, while the venous thrombosis would be pathophysiologically meaning the loss of blood outflow that results in edema, hemorrhage, which may not follow artery territory. Now, who are prone to developing CVT? The young adults, female is greater than male in about 3 is to 1. The median age for having cerebral venous thrombosis is 33 to 37 years old. But remember, it can appear or occur at any age. So risk factors that determines our CVT would include thinking about the virtual aisle, which describes the 3 factors that lead to thrombosis and clot formation. So if you have one or more of this is risk for DVT, pulmonary edema, and stroke, and it goes up. One risk factor will be hypercoagulability because the blood clots more easily than normal. It is caused by inherited factors or acquired factor like cancer, pregnancy, postpartum oral contraceptives, estrogens, smoking, sepsis, trauma, major surgery, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, dehydration, elevated BMP markers like high glucose. Another risk factor will be your venous stasis or stasis of blood flow. Because slow or turbulent blood flow, the clotting factors will not be whisked away. They will be accumulated and form a clot. This is caused by immobility, bed rest, long flights, immobility after subarachnoidal hemorrhage or stroke, atrial fibrillation, heart failure, and even varicose veins, and obstruction by tumor. The number 3 risk factors entails endothelial injury. This is from damage to the inside lining of the blood vessels that exposes collagen and tissue factors. The platelets stick together and the clot cascade will start. This is caused by surgery, trauma, IV catheters, central lines, smoking, hypertension, and prior DVT, even atherosclerosis. But about approximately 12 to 15% would have no cause that can be associated with the development of our CVT. And this is what we call idiopathic CVT. So the clinical presentation can also be mimickers. There are no classic, pattern, or high index of suspicion needed. So several symptoms will mimic our CVT, like your isolated intracranial hypertension, which occurs 40% most of the time, with the same signs and symptoms of headache, papilloedema, cranial nerve 6 palsy, and nausea vomiting because it blocked the cerebrospinal fluid absorption at the arachnoid granulation. The second syndrome is a focal neurologic deficit which occurs 37 to 50% and is manifested by weakness, aphasia, visual loss, and it happened because of the venous infarct or hemorrhage. Then we have the third syndrome, which is seizures that occurs 35 to 40%. The focal or generalized symptoms more commonly than arterial stroke. Now, it happens because of cortical irritation from edema and hemorrhage. The last syndrome associated with CBT is encephalopathy, which occurs about 22%. It is manifested by decreased level of consciousness, confusion, and coma, which is associated with extensive thrombosis, increased intracranial pressure, and thalamic involvement. So there are clues that it is CBT and not something else. Think of young patients, especially women, on oral contraceptive if they're pregnant, or women postpartum if they are dehydrated with cancer, hypercoagulable state like the Richard triad. Then also think that headache that is new, persistent, progressive, and not responding to the usual medication. Or headache accompanied by seizure plus focal deficit in someone without typical stroke risk factors. Or a stroke that doesn't hit an arterial territory. Or hemorrhagic infarct on your CT in parasagittal or temporal lobes. Or a multiple infarct or hemorrhages over time. So what is important is to do a workup of our MRV or our CT venogram and not just a routine CT head. The D dimer can be normal. So we have to do this particular venogram, either MR or CT. Treatment is anticoagulation, even if there is no hemorrhagic venous infarction, which is opposite of arterial stroke. So take a look at some of the headache pearls. Headache, when present in about 80 to 90%, are often the only symptom that can be manifested by patients with cerebral venous thrombosis. The subacute onset goes over days, greater thunderclap, but can be acute. Headache can be worse lying down during Valsalva, and like coughing like increased intracranial pressure. And usually headaches are not relieved by typical medication. So the red flags that you should consider will be headache plus papillary edema in the young women on oral contraceptives, headache with seizures with no stroke risk factors. So don't just rely on non-contrast CT because often these are normal in about 30% and may show the dense triangle sign that clot is superior sagittal sinus, the cord sign, which is hyperdense cortical vein, and the venous infarct doesn't follow arterial territory and often hemorrhagic. Now, CT venogram or MR venogram are the golden standard in the diagnosis of your CBT. They fill out or they get or give defect and absence of flow in the sinuses. MRI and plus your MRV are best for parenchymal lesions in the vein. Detects it detects subacute clot better, and that laboratories that include CBC, PT, international normal ratio, and even your LFTs are something that you should be doing immediately. Your D dimer can be increased, but these are not specific hypercoagulability workup after acute phase. The nursing tip that we can have at this point in the diagnosis is that if CT head is normal, that the patient has unexplained increased intracranial pressure or seizures or headache with neurological deficit, then you must advocate for your CT venogram or your MR venogram because normal CT does not equate with no cerebrovascular, uh, with no cerebral venous thrombosis. So the acute management refers to your anticoagulation therapy, and this is the key to having a good outcome. The paradox that we can say is that the CVT often causes intracerebral hemorrhage, but we treat with heparin. And according to the American Heart and ASA guidelines, plus the ESO guidelines of 2024, anticoagulation, even with the intracerebral hemorrhage, your low molecular weight heparin is preferred over their unfractionated heparin. And the dose would be 1 milligram per kilogram sub-Q twice a day. The rationale for this is that it prevents thrombus propagation and allows for recanalization and reduces your ICP. The hemorrhage is venous from pressure, not arterial, and treating cause helps. Now, if the patient is deteriorating despite your anticoagulation, endovascular thrombectomy and thrombolysis at comprehensive center should be done. You have to manage intracranial pressure by elevating the head of bed to 30 degrees, giving hyperosmolar therapy like mannitol 20% and 3% hypertonic solution if there is herniation, and your EVD if there is hydrocephalus. The compressive craniotomy is also recommended for large hemorrhagic infarct with herniation. For seizures, you have to load Keppra 20 milligrams per kilogram if seizures occur, and prophylaxis controversial will mean using it if supratentorial lesion and hemorrhage appears. You have also to treat the underlying cause with antibiotics for infection, hydration for dehydration, and you have to stop the oral contraceptive. Now, do remember that there are also contraindications to heparin. Only active, expanding, life-threatening bleed with herniation, which is also very, very rare, is a contraindication for giving heparin. So there are nursing priorities and monitoring. You have to do your assessment for neuro exam, headache, vision, papillary, seizure, and bleeding, including INO and daily weight. In this particular slide, we highlight the frequency of monitoring, why we have to monitor, and the action that we have to do if we have to see that these are something reasonably important to manage. The key teaching that I would like to express at this point is that the cerebrovenous thrombosis patient will definitely need hydration and not fluid restriction because dehydration can cause more clotting. So complication that nurses must anticipate will be the following: a new intracerebral hemorrhage expansion, your seizures, your increased intracranial pressure and herniation, pulmonary embolism, and death. And this can be predictable in terms of occurrence or timing, with various signs and symptoms, and a corresponding nursing action that should be done when this complication arises. So the long-term management and discharge education will be information pertaining to anticoagulation, like your warfarin or DOAC, which is given 3 to 12 months. A provoked CVT should be about 3 to 6 months. Unprovoked or severe thrombophilia should be indefinite, with a target NIR 2 to 3 if the patient is in warfarin. You have also to consider stopping triggers by discontinuing your oral contraceptive and HRT hormone replacement therapy, or use non-estrogen contraceptive or pregnancy counseling. Also inform the patient and family of the recurrence of risk, which is about 2 to 3% per year, but is lower than DVT and pulmonary embolism. A follow-up should also be part of your education, wherein you have to recommend MRB at 3 to 6 months to check for recannulation and neurological follow-up. Also inform them about warning signs to return, because a new severe headache or vision changes and weakness, seizure, and SOB are predisposing factors to occurrences and warning signs of an impending CBT. During pregnancy, you have to look at this as high risk, but it's not contraindicated. So you have to give low molecular weight heparin prophylaxis during the entire pregnancy, plus about 6 weeks postpartum of the maternal. So here's a case study. A 28-year-old female, 3 weeks postpartum on oral contraceptive, presents with 5 days headache. Now she experiences left arm weakness with seizures. The CT showed small right frontal hemorrhage, which is not in the middle cerebral artery territory. Now consider these questions and answer them in the chat box. What's your differential? What's on your differential diagnosis? What imaging do you advocate for, and what treatment should be done even with the patient in a hemorrhage stage? So I give you a few seconds to put your answer in the chat box. So if your answer is that your differential diagnosis will be cerebrovenous thrombosis with high suspicion, you're correct. Your imaging that you will be advocating for will be your CT venogram and your MR venogram. You are correct. And your treatment, even with hemorrhage, will be putting the patient on low molecular weight heparin, even if the patient has hemorrhage. Then you are correct. So key takeaways for nurses. You have to think about cerebrovenous thrombosis in young patients with a typical headache and seizure and increased intracranial pressure signs. Also take note that normal CT doesn't rule it out. You have to be recommending your CT venogram or your MR venogram. You have to anticoagulate the patient even with the patient having signs of hemorrhage, because anticoagulation will improve outcome. Remember to always hydrate and do not restrict your fluids, because dehydration worsens the clot. And monitor the patient like a stroke patient with a neuro ICU patient who is at risk for intracranial pressures and seizures. So these are my references, and I thank you for your kind attention. So thank you, and I hope you learned something from this 1 hour lecture. Thank you so much.